Hey everybody, welcome back to VFX Together. My name is Matt. Today we're going to be taking a look at some techniques in After Effects to fake golden hour so that we can take a shot like this and make it look like this. So let's go ahead and get started. Golden hour, for anyone who doesn't know, is basically that time period roughly 45 minutes after sunrise and 45 minutes before sunset when the light in the atmosphere becomes really soft, the shadows get a lot deeper, and the color of everything is kind of cast with a golden hue. Lots of directors and cinematographers absolutely love to get shots like that, and so I'll be the first one to say you can't really fake golden hour. Golden hour is always going to look better if it's naturally filmed, but golden hour is really tricky to do because you only have a period of maybe 15 or 20 minutes where you can get those shots, and if you're on a tight schedule, if you've got a small budget, you may not be able to always get those. So the techniques I'm going to show you here today, they're not going to be perfect. They're never going to get to 100% of the natural quality that you could do if you were on location in the right time of day, but you're going to be able to get pretty close. And even if it's not perfect, it really does make for a cool effect. So let's jump in. The first thing we're going to start with, we've got our footage layer. And in my case, because of some of the things that I want to do, I really want to get a 3D track of this scene. I want to be able to put things in 3D space, have the camera follow it. So I'm going to right click and choose track camera. And we'll let that run through. While it's going, I'm going to flip down under advanced and change the solve method to tripod pan, because the camera doesn't really move very much and you want to try and limit the amount of solving that you're having to do. So because this camera is stationary, we can go with the tripod pan and it'll make it more likely that the camera will get a good solve after it's done calculating. Okay, so the solver is finished, and you can see we've got quite a number of track points, and it was able to make a very clean track on this. Now, your footage may be a little bit different, but usually the idea is you want to keep the camera motions very limited, and you want to have a lot of high contrast points in your scene to be able to track, and you can usually get as good of a result as I've got right here. So the first thing I want to do is create a camera, but I also want to create a point where we can track the sun, because part of what we're going to be doing is adjusting the sunlight to make it look like it's later in the day. So I'm going to right click this little point right here, which is the one closest to the sun, and I'm going to say create null and camera. And so now we have a 3D camera in the scene with the appropriate keyframes to match our scene, and we have a null object that is right in about the same location as our sun. So I'm going to go ahead and just push this way back in Z space, and then I'm going to line it up in the center of the sun, and that'll give the motion, that'll make sure that our motion is pretty close. So as I scrub through there, you can see it sticks pretty well in the center. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with color correcting our footage and making it look like it's closer to sunset. So first thing I'm going to do is just apply a curves correction, color correction curves, and I'm going to play with the contrast to try and get something that looks a little bit more like sunset. So as I mentioned, we get softer light, which means that the difference between dark and light values is going to be less, but we also get deeper shadows. So I'm going to compress the highlights and the shadows a little bit so that we get less difference between highlights and shadows, but then I am going to add a curve at the bottom and deepen all those shadows quite a bit. So now we have a lot darker of a scene, but a little bit softer and just a little bit more dramatic, a little more cinematic. So that's looking pretty good. The next thing I want to do is shift the colors a little bit warmer. So I'm going to go into the blue channel, and just in the highlights, I'm going to drag that down a little bit. And right away you can see all the blue in the sky disappears. And so we're getting much closer. And then the final thing that I want to do is affect the color of the foliage, because when the blue in the sky disappears, when the sunlight gets filtered through the atmosphere, what we start to see is a lot less green, a lot less of that green pigment is reflected, and so everything should turn a lot more red and orange. So we'll go into color correction and add a hue saturation adjustment. And I'm just going to select the greens, and I'm going to crank those pretty far toward the red. Now, you can see in the darker areas of the foliage we get a really good effect, but the lighter areas are still not being affected. So I'm just going to take the edge here of our boundary and drag that out, and maybe adjust a little bit more here in the center until I get something that I like. There we go. So that looks pretty good. Now we're really starting to get something that looks like sunset. So the next thing that I want to do is adjust the sunlight. So when the sun is really high in the sky, it's usually very white, whereas when it's lower, it takes on, that yellowish, then orange, then reddish hue. And since we're looking directly at the sun in part of this shot, I want to see if we can kind of fake that a little bit. So I'm going to create a new solid. We're going to call this sun flare. And I'm going to apply a lens flare. Now, After Effects comes with its own lens flare effect. You can pick a flare that is close to what you want. And we can change the blending mode to screen. Center that on our sun. And we get a pretty decent effect. So you can definitely do it this way. Unfortunately, because the options in the standard After Effects lens flare is limited, there's basically only 3 options and a little bit of brightness control. Even if you apply some tints or blurs or things like that, anybody in the industry who's worked with After Effects long enough is going to be able to spot this as a fake effect. So I don't like to use lens flare unless I absolutely have to. I happen to have Video Copilot optical flares installed. I'm going to use that for the tutorial, but if you have Null Light Factory, any of the Red Giant plugins, anything that can generate a flare that's a little more unique, I would definitely recommend that over the basic plugin that comes with After Effects. Basic plugin works fine if that's all you've got, but a good flare plugin is usually a good investment if you're going to be doing a lot of this kind of work. So I'm not going to spend too much time in here because every plugin is going to be a little bit different, but I'm just going to go in and find a flare that I like, and we'll work with that one. So I like this flare. You can see that the edges of the color are a little bit darker, are a little bit more yellow. I'm actually going to increase the tint on this even more toward red and orange. Something like that. That looks pretty good. Now what I need to do is make sure that the sun flare is following my tracked point. Now our tracked point is 3D and our sun flare is 2D. So what we need to do is get After Effects to convert a 3D coordinate into a 2D screen coordinate that we can use to position our flare. And we can do that pretty easily. We just alt-click on the stopwatch, and we are going to type in this _comp.layer. And we're going to type in the name of the layer that we need to find. So that's our track null 1. .2 _comp parentheses bracket 0, 0 end bracket end parentheses. So what this is going to do is it's going to take this layer, take its position, whatever that position is, and convert it to a comp coordinate, left and right and up and down. And so we'll click away and nothing changes because we already had our optical flare kind of in the right position. But now if I solo that, as I scrub forward and backward, it moves along with our point. And that's exactly what we want. So that works pretty well. And now we get that really cool natural flare effect. And the reason that I'm adding some flare, there was already a little bit of flare, but the reason I'm adding it more is when the sun is lower in the sky, you tend to get more of that flare because the angle of incidence with the lens is lower. And so I wanted to just kind of emphasize that. It's just one more thing to kind of trick the mind into thinking that that the time of day is later than it really is. So that's starting to look really good. I really like how our shadows roll off in the dark parts. I like how our highlights are working. And now the last thing that I want to do is add some dust particles that are falling down. This is a heavily wooded area, so presumably there's lots of pollen and debris and things like that. And the later in the day, the lower the angle of the sun, the more that sort of thing gets reflected. So I want to add that as our final kind of trick to really sell this effect. So the first thing I'm going to do is just add some sunbeams. I want to get a filtering of light through the trees. And this is going to be just a really basic effect. I'm going to duplicate my footage layer. I'm going to bring that just under the sun flare. I'm going to remove the 3D tracker and the hue and saturation, because all we really need is the contrast curve for this. I'm going to add an extract modifier. And I'm just going to crank the black point all the way up and the softness up. So if I solo this, you can see what I've created is basically leave nothing but the white part of the image. And so I'm going to put another curves adjustment on here. And bring that all the way up just so we get solid white and solid black. And I'm going to use this to simulate sunbeams casting through the trees. I'm going to go to blur and sharpen, and I'm going to add a radial blur. We're going to change the type to zoom, and we are going to crank the amount up. And right away you can see that we're starting to get these really cool kind of God ray effects. Now what I want to do to sell this is make sure that this center point tracks along with the sun. And we're going to do that exactly the same way that we did the flare. Alt-click on the center, this comp.layer, track null 1, .2 comp, 0, 0, and click away. And now that point is tracking along with our null as well. So as I scrub through now, you can see that the angle of the rays are changing along with the sun. And we get an effect that looks a lot more like there's just kind of a fine mist or haze in the ground, and we even get some cool rays coming down into the forest floor. So I'm really liking how that looks. I'm going to adjust this and make sure that we are making this a screen overlay, and I'm going to throw a little bit of a blur on it just because I want it to be a little bit softer. I'm just going to try maybe like 15. Yeah, I'm really liking that now. The last thing I want to do is try to add some actual particulate matter that is maybe streaming around in the air. That'll just be one more thing that we can do to sell the effect. First thing I'm going to do, just so that I have a reference for myself, is I'm going to create a new solid. We're going to call this ground. And I'm going to go to Generate Grid and make that a little bit smaller. Bring down the border size. I'm going to turn this into a 3D layer, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. Now where that ground is, or where that grid is aligned with the world, the 3D virtual world along the ground. So what I want to do is now take my camera, my 3D track camera, and align that to match the ground layer. Because once I do, that means that the 3D tracked camera and the background are going to be pretty well lined up. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to create a new null object. And this is what I'm going to use. I'm going to parent everything we've done to that null object so that as I adjust it, everything moves along with it. So the first thing I want to do is put this null object in the same position and rotation as the camera in whatever frame I'm working with. So I'm just going to go to the very end, and I am going to copy the position and the rotation keyframes. Come up here to the null and paste them. Okay? Oh, make sure your null is a 3D object, otherwise it will not work. Okay. So I'm going to paste those. And then I'm going to remove the keyframes so they simply have that value. It's not going to be animated. It's just going to start out in the same rotation and position as the camera. And so now I can pick whip and parent the camera and, very important, my other null object, the null tracker for the sun, parent both of those to my new null object. So now, if I adjust my null object, you're going to notice everything else stays in the same position relative to the camera. And now all I need to do is I'm just going to zero out. Now that my camera is attached to this null object, if I zero out all of my rotation and position values, this should bring the camera itself back to the origin, back to 0, 0, 0 in 3D space. Excellent. And now I can rotate until I see my grid. So let's go back to a single view, and now I can start playing with position and rotation to align myself appropriately. So hopefully this makes sense what I'm doing. Basically all I'm doing right now is I am creating a guide that is going to help me as the artist visually figure out where to place other 3D objects in my scene. This is not strictly necessary to do a 3D track, but it makes it a lot easier for what I'm about to show you. Okay, so now that we've got our camera oriented appropriately to the origin, which is the 0, 0, 0 point in 3D space, everything's looking pretty good. I like kind of how the ground is. I might flatten this out just a little bit more. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to show you why that was so important to do. Like I mentioned, I wanted to add some particulate matter and make that kind of fall toward the ground. I'm going to create a new solid. We're going to call this particles. And I'm going to apply simulate CC particle world. Now, particle world comes with After Effects. It's actually reasonably powerful, but a lot of artists I see online don't use it. Most people are using Trapcode Particular, which is a much more powerful tool, but not actually strictly necessary for a lot of the things that I see people doing. The main benefit of Particular over Particle World is that Particular will use the 3D cameras that are in a scene, and Particle World has its own camera. But it's really fairly trivial to make Particle World follow a real camera, or follow an After Effects camera. Basically what we have to do is we just dial down under Extras, go to our Effect Camera, and we've got our rotation X, Y, and Z. And I'm just going to Alt-click on each one of those. I'm going to bring up my camera position, and I'm going to pick whip X. Oops, I'm not position, I'm sorry, orientation. I'm going to pick whip my X, Y, and Z values to the X, Y, and Z values of the orientation. Now, when the camera rotates, you'll notice that the particles rotate as well, and that's exactly what I want. So you can see it's very easy to get Particle World to play nice with a 3D camera. It's really not that difficult. I don't understand why people always rush to Trapcode Particular just to do something that basic. Okay, so we're going to take the producer, which is the area where the particles are being generated, and I'm going to crank up the radius to, say, 15 by 15 by 15. And that'll pretty well cover the whole area of view of the camera. So right away, as you can see, we've got these just basic particles that are falling through the scene. And they look pretty good up until the camera kind of lands, and then you can see that they're falling a little bit faster than I'd like. So we're going to go into the physics. We're going to change the animation to viscous. We're going to change the velocity down to like 0.1 and the gravity down to 0.05. And now we should get the motion should be more that they're just kind of hanging in the air. Then we're going to go to the particle and change this from a line to a faded sphere. And then I want to take the birth rate and the longevity and crank these up. So longevity, I'm going to take that all the way to, say, 15. And the birth rate, I just want to increase until I've got a look that I feel is natural. So I actually want to crank this really high, and then I'm going to go down into the particle information, and I'm going to set the size really low, so maybe 0.15. And now what I've got is, maybe go just a little bit bigger. So now we've got these very small little particles, just kind of, you can barely tell that they're there, but they add a lot of depth to the scene. They're still dropping pretty quickly, so I'm going to take the gravity and I'm going to put it just really far down. I still want a little bit of influence on that gravity, but I don't want it to be, I don't want these particles to be moving very much at all. There we go. And maybe the last thing I'm going to do is go back into our sunray effect, go into color correction, and I'm just going to tint this a little bit. We'll make it kind of a little bit, not very much at all, but I want to shift that a little bit toward the orange, maybe like that. And there we go. A pretty easy way to take a normal daylight scene and give it those qualities of golden hour that a lot of directors and cinematographers are looking for, but without the stress of having to do it on site, on the day, in 15 or 20 minutes. So like I said before, it's not going to 100% replace the shots. If you have the opportunity to film during golden hour in the real world, I recommend that you do that. But this gives you a little bit more freedom. If you say try to get the shot and you fail and you don't have any more time left, this can save that effect. This can save that shot and get it to the way the director maybe had it in their head, even if you weren't able to do it all in camera. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions or suggestions for new tutorials, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you want to keep up on my latest tutorials, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.